Recall from going over the anatomy of the brain that the cerebrum is broken up into different regions, different lobes that we talk about. And there are four main lobes that we break the cerebral cortex in, and then like one minor lobe. So I'm going to put these up here. Remember, you have the frontal lobe. Okay. And in pink, we're going to put, you have the parietal lobe. So hopefully you remember these from going over the anatomy of the brain. You have the occipital lobe. Okay. Then you have, let's do purple down here, you have the temporal lobe. That's the last of what I'll call the major lobes. Okay. And then you have a region that sort of hides back behind the temporal lobe, which is known as the insula. Remember that? Insula. Okay, so your frontal lobe, right? All of these different lobes and these cortices, there are two different or three different regions and areas that we talk about. There can be what we call sensory areas, which are going to receive sensory input, right? And they're going to translate that into perception. That's your awareness of that thing. Okay, there are motor areas which direct movement. And then there are association areas. And these association areas basically take all this information and integrate it together. It helps you do things like know that when you taste a pickle, that that's a pickle, or oh, you hate pickles, right? So it's sort of the association area sort of helps tie in memories and all of that stuff with these different senses, right? So your frontal lobe here, right, your frontal lobe is going to consist of something called the primary motor cortex, which is going to be involved in muscle movement. And we're going to talk more about that when we get to actual muscle movement, right? And then you have what we call the premotor cortex. And the premotor cortex is an association area where it's going to get information from the cerebellum. It's going to get information from other sorts of regions of the brain to start planning some sort of movement. And then your frontal lobe is also going to contain the what we call the prefrontal cortex. Okay, and our prefrontal cortex contains a lot of association areas, and this region is what is responsible for mammals' higher level of thinking, or you as a human, your higher level of thinking. Okay, your parietal lobe is going to consist of what we call the primary somatic sensory cortex. Okay, so this is going to receive sensory information, and then it is going to have your sensory association area. Okay, so this is again going to integrate information about those senses. Right, so does having a painful or experiencing pain trigger some sort of memory or some sort of response? Right. Your occipital lobe is going to be your visual cortex. So this is where it's going to receive sensory information from the optic tracts, right? Those optic neurons coming back into the brain. They're going to come back to this visual cortex. And then you have the visual association area, right? So your visual association area helps you sort of understand what it is that you're seeing, right? Like you see a friend, their facial features, right? When you see those facial features, you know that that's that person or that's your friend. Okay. Go down here to our temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is going to contain the auditory cortex, right? And what sort of information is going to come in here? Right? Information about hearing, and then you're going to have an auditory association area. Okay? Then you're going to have an olfactory cortex. Okay? And you're going to have, yep, you guessed it, an olfactory association area. Okay? And then in the insula there, right, that's where you're going to have your gustatory cortex. What is gustatory? That's your taste, right? So tastants come from there. And guess what? That's right, you're going to have a good gustatory association area. Okay? So all these different regions of the cerebral cortex are going to gain all of this information, right? And so there is something known as what we refer to as cerebral lateralization. I'm going to write that down here. Cerebral lateralization. Okay. And what this means is that you have two hemispheres, right? You have a right hemisphere, you have a left hemisphere. What this cerebral lateralization says is that the distribution of these areas in the different hemispheres is not equal to one another. You have what's called cerebral dominance, right? Or what we might refer to as right-brained or left-brained, right? And so where are these sort of regions concentrated? So people that tend to say we are left-brained, right? They have language and verbal skills concentrated in that left hemisphere, right? So there's not an equal distribution of these different areas in both hemispheres, right? So you do have what we refer to as cerebral lateralization.